Hi, David Vizard here, and you guys are watching Powertec 10. In this issue, 132, it's been a long time coming. Probably 3 weeks ago now, maybe a month ago, we got some cylinder heads from AFR to do some advanced testing on. Well, the extent to which we test cannot be done in a couple of hours. Flow tests by themselves are just not enough. We've done extensive flow testing to a level you will not find anywhere else in the industry. But not only that, we've dynoed them and drag strip tested. What's the subject? AFR's new LS3 heads, introduced probably around about the end of February 2024. So, starting with me unpacking, here we go. Well, Dave, my friendly UPS guy, dropped this off today, and I can tell it's from AFR, and I know what it is. It's the single copy of the new LS head that AFR got. Now, the reason I called them for a bare copy here, if you watched the earlier video, is that we wanted to section one up. That always breaks my heart. The better the casting, the worse it is. It's like, you know, you're doing harm to something that's valuable, but hey, that's it. Now, as usual, I asked them if they have a blem, and they said, no, we don't have blems. Our casting quality is, as you know, well up there. And you know, even though I ask for a blem every time, because it will do, I'll saw through wherever the blem is, so it won't matter for what I'm doing here. But they haven't had a blem for probably 15 years. I say probably, that's about the way I remember it. So anyway, here's the head. I'm going to open it up and see what they've sent me here. As usual, AFR's packing is just as quality, how should I say, a quality endeavor as doing their cylinder heads. Everything you get from AFR that I've ever had has always been very nicely packed. You know, that's a sure sign that they care about their products. Right, let's have a look. Yes, 2 valves in, and otherwise bare head. So let's get this dude out. And here we have it. Right, I'll just zoom in for a close-up. First thing on the agenda for this is to pour the ports. Now, it's very convenient that we already have an intake and exhaust valve in there, so that's the next job to do. I'm going to pour the intake first, then the exhaust, so that we have an accurate replica of the shape of the port. Now, let me make a point here, and I'll do this early on. It won't make much sense here, but later on it might. When we tested this cylinder head, we found that there was a factor which, if you bought a pair of these AFR heads and went ahead, as per would normally be the case, and used it as the only change on the engine, or maybe intake ports and things like this, but you didn't touch the camshaft, then you'd be missing out. To find out what it's so far secret is, be sure to watch part 2. When I say it's worth a minimum of 20 horsepower and 20 foot-pounds, I mean a minimum. Now, in the worst case scenario, it could be worth 40, maybe even as much as 50 horsepower. You can't afford to throw that away. So subscribe and watch part 2. That's my advice right now. The first step here is to pour in the catalyst to allow the molding fluid to set off. When you're mixing it, try not to stir it too heavily so as not to introduce air bubbles. Once you've done that and it's thoroughly mixed, then pour it into the cylinder head as you see here. Wait 5 or 6 hours and it should be ready to push out. Here's the port mold after we removed it with great difficulty from the cylinder head. I think I've put a little bit too much hardener in there and it's a very stiff one. We put a plate on there and an air chisel and it came out with 300-pound blows, so job done. But what I want to show here is the bias on the port. See, this is the cylinder wall side here. Air comes down the port, it spreads here at the thicker part, thus slowing it down to go around the turn here. Now, we want the air, now let me just turn this around here. So, cylinder wall here, we want the air to come down here and out towards the center of the cylinder, which in this situation would be here. So, we have to bias the wall here. It certainly can't come out this side. So if we make it easier for the air to come around here and then over like this, what will happen is it should pick up flow after it gets past the 0.25D lift point. Now 0.25D, that is 0.25 of the diameter of the intake valve, or as it's so often called, quarter D. If it does that, it should get swirl. Now it's a big port, so at low lift we're not likely to have a lot of swirl, but we'll see. And as for getting around the short side turn, you'll see it's a pretty generous radius here, right? The whole port looks pretty effective if you consider that it's restricted from going from this point here to this point here. That and this here are fixed. So whoever designed this port, or whoever they may have been who designed this port, had only the option of the shape from here to here. No raising the port or anything or changing valve angles. So let's see how they did. Now let's remember, the stock LS3 head is pretty good. Let's go to the flow bench now and see what we have. Carla and Charlie ran the tests. He was shouting out the numbers over the din of the flow bench and she would write them down. From here we went to the IOP program. Using the figures that Charlie and Carla had generated, I entered that and the data for the cylinder head into the IOP program, which is now coming up. This is a program that Stan Weiss and I wrote specifically to better aid head porters. If you feel you want a copy, then go to the link shown here. Cost of this program, $125. Hitting the enter button takes you to the opening page. The principal entries at this point are the compression ratio, the bore, the stroke, and the number of cylinders. The port area we will extract from the following sheet, which will be our flow data sheet. On this data sheet, we fill out such things as the port volume, intake valve diameter, valve stem diameter, throat diameter, and the port centerline length for both the intake and exhaust. From there, we go over and enter the port dimensions. This, of course, will be done for both cylinder heads. Here in red are the numbers for the stock cylinder head. These are followed by the numbers for the AFR head. To assimilate the differences between these two heads, it's best to look at it in graphical form. Here's a comparison of both the intake and exhaust ports. You will see that there isn't a great deal of difference between the two if it's just the flow figures that we're checking out here. However, as I've said many times, the flow figures are not even quite half the story. So let's look at each of these flow curves in turn. The first thing to do is to look at the discharge coefficients. For those of you unfamiliar with the term discharge coefficient or coefficient of discharge, let me simplify it. Basically, it describes the flow efficiency of the port. At low valve lift, it's applicable to it's controlled by the gap between the seats. That's the seats of the valve and the seats in the head. At high lift, it's more a function of the shape of the port. But anyway, let's just check out what we've got here. As you can see from this chart, the heavy blue line, which is the AFR head, really surpasses the efficiency of the stock head. Now the arrows here are indicating the 0.25D lift point for each valve. Now remember, the stock valve is bigger than the AFR valve, so the point will be further up the scale. Now, the scale on the bottom is relevant to the AFR head. Notice that at the 0.25D lift point, the efficiency takes off in an upward direction. This inflection at the 0.25D lift indicates that the port has good bias on it and it is able to window once it goes over the 0.25D lift point. Good marks for AFR for shaping the port to do such. Moving on to the exhaust, we find a similar pattern. The AFR head, that's the thick red line, rarely gives away any efficiency to the stock port. Yes, there's a few little crossovers down low, but once it gets to mid-range lift and on up, it takes off. At the 0.25D point, it really takes off. Again, top marks to AFR for getting the job done right. Statement emphasizing the importance of port velocity was made by my fellow head porter, Darren Morgan. He made the statement that there's three things that are most important with porting cylinder heads. That is velocity, velocity, and velocity. I wish more people would listen to that statement because it rings true in so many cases. So let's have a look at the AFR head compared to the stock head. Remember, the AFR head has smaller valve and a smaller port cross-sectional area. So let's take a look at those all-important velocity curves and see how they work out. Here's the intake. As defined by this program, 300 to 330 feet per second is the magic range over which we need the port velocity to attain at the full valve lift used. As you can see, the stock head never gets to 300 feet per second. On the other hand, our AFR head gets to some 312 feet per second when it's lifted up to the 680-700 range. So, a head like this will benefit from a high lift cam. So good marks again for AFR for achieving that magic number. As for the exhaust, it achieved the 300 feet per second goal in even better style than the intake. This occurred at a lift range that would be well within the capabilities of any street valve train. Now here's where we get to something that's a little different from what you'll see in most cylinder head test videos. We are going to look at the change in port energy from the stock head to the AFR head. The higher the port energy is, the more likely the cylinder head is to make good torque figures. Port energy increases indicate that we should get better cylinder ramming as the RPMs go up. Here's our first port energy curve on the intake. Let me quickly explain the significance of port energy. Imagine the air in the port as if it's a slug or a bullet, and the gap between the valve is the resistance to the passage of the bullet or slug of air from the port to the cylinder. This can be likened to a bullet having to pass through a block of ballistic gel. More energy the bullet's got, the further it will penetrate that ballistic gel. The same with the air. The more energy it's got, the more it will push past and penetrate the resistance caused by the valve. Now if you've got that, you'll understand just how significant the port energy is, and it's something that is rarely, if ever, talked about other than on this channel. In many respects, the port energy gains in the exhaust are also significant. Any increase in velocity here means that the charge is denser or can be denser going out, so it has more energy to extract the gases from the combustion chamber, especially during the last part of the overlap. A good port velocity here is important. Why? Because there's a spike in the port velocity generated by the piston as it reaches TDC. If you can keep that going, then it tends to extract the gases better. Now there is a method by which we can judge the effectiveness of our cylinder head and make a comparison of it with any cylinder head out there. Now this comparison is based on function only, so you can make a direct comparison of how good you're doing with your cylinder head compared with the Formula 1 head. Now interestingly enough, top performing 2-valve heads do rival 4-valve heads in many respects, if we're using a valve size as the criteria. So it's good to be able to make those comparisons, because we can see exactly what a 4 or 5-valve head may be worth over a 2-valve head. And often when making a top comparison like a pro stock head with a Formula 1 head, the gap is not as big as you might think it is. Now most of you won't be familiar with any numbers that equate to how good a cylinder head is in terms of port energy density. So take a look at this graph. Most 2-valve cylinder heads, and I'm talking about ported ones here typically, fall between the two red lines. So you can see that the AFR head is better than average. So where does a Formula 1 head come in on this? Somewhere around the 35 to 40. So as a 2-valve head, this is good. But overall, there's some ways to go. However, that's limited by where the air goes in compared with where it comes out at the valve. Now, if we were to take a Pro stock head, some of those are up in the 30 to 35 range. Excellent. So what we've got here is a cylinder head where, using the stock positioning of port and valve, they've done a very good job of improving over a factory one, which in itself was very good. So that's where we're at with this cylinder head. It's a very good cylinder head. Definitely, if you are going to buy a pair of cylinder heads for an engine build, I would recommend these instead of buying the factory ones. If you're going to port either of them, I would recommend these as a starting point because they're already very good. Now, can we improve on them? Of course we can. Just don't expect a huge gain because 95% of it's probably already there. Now, if we were to increase the valve size and the port size, then okay, we've got a completely different deal there because now it's a big valve, big port head instead of being a moderate valve, moderate port head. So, what's this head good for? Well, anything up to a race entry level head, right? I say race entry because AFR have got a CNC ported one here, which will blow your socks off. Hopefully we can do a test on that, but it's the CNC ported version of this head. Flows somewhere around 380 CFM, which is mighty good for a head like this. Anyway, that's it on this cylinder head for now. So thank you for watching, and please subscribe, notify, comment, and all that good stuff. Now, don't forget, I've got a factor in part 2 of this, which will enable you to see about another 20, 30, maybe even as much as 40 horsepower gain over the gains we've seen here. And it's all to do with the camshaft, selecting the cam for this cylinder head. I will see you on part 2. Thank you for watching.